Hi guys, this is Mr. Tan. We're still focusing on contract law, and now we're going into a little bit more detail of the offer and communication of the offer. So when we look at this, what we're basically saying is that in order for the offer to be effective, it must be communicated. So there can be no acceptance of the offer without actually knowing about the offer in the first place. And also, there cannot be any assent without knowledge of the offer. And ignorance of the offer is the same as, well, not really knowing it in the first place or hearing about it and then forgetting it. And we're going to look at two cases here that kind of looks at this, and that is Gibbons versus Proctor in 1891 and R versus Clark 1927. Now, in Gibbons versus Proctor 1891, the police put an advertisement, and the advert stated that the police would give a reward to anyone who brought the superintendent information leading to a criminal's arrest. The claimant, who was in fact a police officer, asked a co-worker, put some information forward about the criminal to the superintendent. But at that time, the police officer didn't actually know about the offer. But before the information had got to the superintendent, he did find out about the offer. Now, again, the question was this an offer or an invitation to treat, because it was an ad? And it was held in the High Court that in favour of the claimant, the advert was an offer. This was because it was put there without any scope for further negotiations on contract terms. So in this instance we can see this was an offer, and the claimant had won the case. If we look at the second case of R versus Clark 1927, well, again, the government warrant had offered a reward of £1,000 for information leading to the conviction of two murders of two policemen, and suggested that a pardon might even be available to any accomplice, not being the person who had actually committed the murder. So there were two suspects, Clark and T, who were arrested in connection with the killings. Clark made a statement and gave evidence, and after which T was convicted for that murder. Nobody was actually charged for the other policeman's murder. And later on, Clark later claimed the reward for the first time. It went to the Supreme Court, and it was held that the claimant did not rely upon this offer for the intentions of entering into a contract. He didn't make it in his statement that he was making this statement to actually get the £1,000. So again, why the convictions will not have come about was the evidence, and so the Crown obtained it without the offer and the claimant actually knowing about the offer. And it was also held that the motive, though not be to confuse with intention, is very often strong evidence that the state of the mind, so the motive can never really usurp the legal place of intention. So he didn't have, he didn't know about the offer, and it wasn't his intention to actually provide that information for the £1,000 that was being offered. So in this instance, the claimant R had not actually won his case, and this was in favour of the government. So thank you for that. So now we move on to the acceptance of the offer. And what we're saying here is that for a contract to be formed, there must be an acceptance of the offer. The acceptance must be an agreement to each of the terms to the offer. So it is sometimes said that acceptance must mirror image the offer. But let's look at two cases here. Brogden versus Metropolitan Railway Company. In this case here, in 1871, what happened was Brogden was supplying coal on an informal basis to Metropolitan Railway Company for many years, but then they decided to make it formal and enter into a contractual agreement. Brogden, the railway company, actually formed and wrote a contract and sent it on to Brogden, but Brogden made some minor amendments and sent it back to Metropolitan Railway Company. And the Metropolitan Railway Company filed it, and then they continued doing business. So Brogden continued supplying coal, and the Metropolitan Railway Company would take that coal and then pay them for that amount. But then there was an issue, and they had a problem, and then Metropolitan Railway Company said that there was no acceptance because there was a counter offer. But the House of Lords held that there was actually a valid contract between Metropolitan Railway Company and Brogden, because even though there was a counter offer, the prices agreed in the draft contract were paid and the coal was delivered. So although there had been no communication of acceptance, performing a contract without any objections was enough. So in other words, there was acceptance by performance. So and acceptance occurs when the offeree's words or conduct give rise to the objective inference that the offeree assents to the offerer's terms. And we can see likewise the counter offer in Hyde versus Wrench. In the case of Hyde versus Wrench, Mr. Wrench had offered his farm for the sale of £1,200 to Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde declined that amount, and then Mr. Wrench offered £1,000 for his farm. Mr. Hyde then offered Mr. Wrench £950 for the farm. But then Mr. Wrench refused this offer of £950. Subsequent to that, Mr. Hyde said that he would accept the £1,000 that Mr. Wrench had offered. But by this time, Mr. Wrench was a little bit fed up and he said no, and he refused to sell his farm for £1,000 to Mr. Hyde. So this went to court, and it was held that yes, there was an offer, but there was no acceptance, and the fact that Mr. Hyde had made an offer of £950 had counteracted and counter-offered the first contract, and therefore nullifying the first offer. So therefore, what Mr. Hyde was doing, in effect, was making an offer, was making an offer for the new price of £1,000, and not accepting that £1,000, and Mr. Wrench had refused the acceptance of that £1,000. There are some exceptions, to the need for communication of the acceptance, and this can be in a few cases, seen where the offerer has waived the requirement for acceptance, as seen in Carlisle versus Cobble Smoke Company, a unilateral contract, and also seen in Fenthouse versus Bingley. The argument there was made that the uncle had clearly waived any need for his nephew to communicate his acceptance of the offer, and yet the court held that the offer had not been accepted. And then we go to the poster rule, and if we look at the poster rule and we look at Adams versus Lindsay in 1818, the defendant was actually offering to sell some of his wool, and he was asking for a reply by post. And on receiving the letter, Adams basically made and accepted the offer for the wool at the price that Lindsay was offering it to him at. However, the letter got delayed, and as a consequence, Lindsay didn't think that Adams had accepted the offer, and therefore he sold the wool to a third party. And this went to court, and it was held that there was a valid contract, and the contract came into existence at the moment the letter of acceptance was placed in the post box, obviously placed in the post box correctly with the full name and address and details, and also with the stamp as well and everything else. So this established the poster rule. So when the letter had been posted, then the acceptance was made. And this was also seen in the case of Household Fire Insurance versus Grant. And Mr. Grant applied for some shares in the company, and the company actually received it and filed it, and raised the amount of issue for the shares in the company. But they sent a letter, but the letter got lost. So the defendant didn't know that he had actually bought those shares in the company, but his offer had been accepted, and therefore there was a valid contract. The company went into liquidation, and once going into liquidation, liquidators actually asked for that sum of money, and it was held in the courts that there was a valid contract, and that the defendant had to actually pay that amount to the liquidator, because when the letter was posted, it became valid and acceptance was made.